This is one of my biblical lectures, which I entitled The 11th Commandment. Here it is. Thou shalt read only the King James Version Bible. How many of you have heard this particular idea? There are some people who claim that this is just the best version of the Bible, and there are others who claim that other translation, especially NIV, which is New International Version, but also New King James Version, adulterated, that the translators purposely adulterated the text and things of that nature. Here is one argument you may hear, although this is more of a joke. It says, if the King James Version was good enough for the apostles, it is good enough for me. Of course, the apostles have not used the King James Version, as the King James Version Bible was published in 1611. The Bible was actually written mainly in Hebrew. Almost the entire Old Testament was written in Hebrew with some exceptions. Some passages were written in Aramaic. And the New Testament was written mainly in Greek, okay? And so King James Version is a translation, and as it states here, it was published in the 17th century. Furthermore, King James Version translators did not have the Dead Sea Scrolls available to them. I hope you are familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's likely, if not the most important, one of the most important biblical findings ever. It has to do with findings, hundreds of manuscripts that date back to the time of Jesus and are even older. Some of them apparently go back as the 2nd century before Christ, and other manuscripts date as late 1st century or even the beginning of the 2nd century AD. When new translations of the Bibles were made, translators had the comfort of comparing existing Bible text that was in use for the translators of King James Version with those Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1947. And so, although there are not very many differences, there are some differences in between what we call the Masoretic text, which was available for the King James Version translation, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and sometimes we find that there were some mistakes in the Masoretic text, which in translations such as the New King James Version were corrected in comparison to the older version, King James Version of the Bible. Also, there have been several revisions to the original version of the King James Version in the last 400 plus years. And so even those who use the King James Version Bible are using actually, or I should say, are not using the original translation of the King James Version of the Bible. Okay, so these are just a few facts regarding the King James Version. I would like to discuss in this lecture a few accusations against some other translations of the Bible and look at whether there is anything to them. I will show you one based on this internet site that I found in an article written by someone by the name of David Daniels. I honestly have no idea who this person is, but he claims to be the author of many books on the Bible versions. And here's what he claims on his website. What is wrong with the New King James Version? All it does is modernize the words of the King James Bible, right? Why should I read the King James and not the helpful New King James? This is some questions that he asked. And here is his answer. The New King James is not a King James Bible. It changed thousands of words, ruined valuable verses, and when not agreeing with the King James Bible, it has instead copied the perverted New International Version, New American Standard Version, or Revised Standard Version. And this you must know, those who translated the New King James Version did not believe God perfectly preserved His Word. Further, he says, I have gotten more letters on this question than almost any other. This is very important to those who want God's truth in the English language. I myself used New King James Version for a decade before I learned the truth about the preserved words of God. Here are some of what convinced me to switch to the King James Version from the New King James. And he actually lists, I think, about 5 different issues. Some are absolutely minor, but I will address one in details here. But before I do that, I would like to point out that he claims that the New King James Version has thousands of words that are changed in comparison to King James, suggesting, as it seems to me at least, suggesting that as there are thousands of words that are perhaps wrong in the New King James Version, and yet he lists really a handful on his website, and again some are completely minor. Okay, but let's look at this particular one that he lists as the first one and claims to be a big deal. Here is an example. Is Jesus God's son or God's servant? In Acts 3:26, the New King James Version calls Jesus God's servant. The King James Version, correctly according to him, calls him God's son. They are not the same by any stretch of the imagination. Which one is he? If he is God's servant, so are you and I. If he is God's son, then we all need to listen to what he said, because he's God. Changed words like this make a great deal of difference in how we understand a passage. Well, I have to agree with at least one statement here, and that is that change words can have a tremendous meaning. But I would like to also show you in the next few minutes that this person, even though he claims to be the author of many books on biblical translation, has absolutely no idea what he's talking about in regard to this particular passage. Let me show you why I say that. First, he is correct to point out that the King James Version of the Bible, corrected in Acts 3:26, translated in Acts 3:23, Greek word pais as son, okay, rather than servant, which is the case in New King James Version. Okay, whether we are talking son or servant, both of these English words are translated from the same Greek word pais. Okay, but I would like to point out that notice in the King James Version of the Bible, most of the time the word pais, the Greek word pais, is translated as a servant rather than a son. In fact, only 3 times notice son, as in for Christ, and 2 times, and son 1 time. Pais is translated as son. So son is actually an exception rather than rule. Most of the time notice servant 10 times, man servant 1 time, maid 1 time, maiden, okay, and so on. Most of the time this Greek word is translated as servant. Furthermore, we find that there is another Greek word for son, as stated clearly in this passage from the book of Matthew 3:17. And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son." The Greek word here is huios, in whom I am well pleased. Okay, and this word huios is consistently translated in King James Version as Son. Notice Son 85 times, Son of Man 87 times, Son of God 49 times, and so on and so on. Consistently is translated as Son. Yet in the book of Acts 3:26, the verse in question, the author Luke did not use the word huios. He used the word pais, and I will show you that he did so for a purpose. Notice in the book of Acts, in another passage, we find the word pais. And here in King James Version, one time the word pais is translated as servant, who by the mouth of thy servant David has said. In another passage, it was translated as child here, for of a truth against the holy child Jesus. While in the New King James Version, in both passages, or in both places, Greek word pais is translated as servant. Okay, and so the New King James Version is actually more consistent than it is King James Version. Okay, that's another point. Most importantly, I would like to point out here to you this passage from the book of Matthew chapter 12, 14 and 18. And this is taken from King James Version translation. Notice, when the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him, but when Jesus knew it, he withdrew himself from there, and great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all, and charged them that they should not make him known, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, "Behold my servant." This word servant here is translated from the Greek word pais, "whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall shew judgment on the Gentiles." Notice that in this passage, the King James Version translators translated pais as servant. And so importantly, it must be asked, Mr. Daniels and others who claim that there is a big problem in translating pais in the book of Acts 3:26 as servant, why it was okay for the King James Version translators to translate the same Greek word pais in the book of Matthew as servant. Okay, that's a very important point. Okay, notice that number one, the Greek word pais is in the King James Version translated as servant in the book of Matthew, and number two, King James Version is inconsistent. In the book of Matthew, it translated pais as servant, while in the book of Acts, it translated the word as son. Furthermore, notice that this passage is referring to what was spoken of by Isaiah the prophet. So let's look at where this is taken from. It is taken from the book of Isaiah, chapter 42, verse 1. "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my elect one, in whom my soul delights." And here the word servant is translated, or not translated rather, but in this passage the Hebrew word for servant is ebed, which means nothing but ebed, but servant. Okay, and this is the Septuagint version, and notice that it is the Hebrew word ebed is not translated as huios, but pais. Okay, and when we look again at this Hebrew word ebed, it's always translated as, or not almost, but the vast majority of the time as servant, and or manservant and bondman and so on. Okay, it is a slave or servant. Here we have an explanation from the Strong Concordance: a servant who amongst the Hebrews was commonly a slave. Okay, and so when we look at the context of Isaiah 42, what do we find? That this is a messianic prophecy. A messianic prophecy that in the Gospels is applicable to Jesus. In fact, notice this passage, for example: a bruised reed he will not break, okay, and smoking flax he will not quench. This is in the Gospels, applicable again to Jesus as the Messiah. And so by translating the book of Acts 3:26, pais as servant, the authors or the translators in the New King James Version recognize that Luke, the author of the book of Acts, actually is saying by putting the pais as Jesus was the ebed from the book of Isaiah. As translation, he was the Messiah, because this is a messianic text or messianic prophecy. Okay, and so Mr. Daniels, whoever he is, he may have many books on Bible translations, but he does not know what he's talking about when he uses Acts 3:26 as an example of a perverted, in his words, translation of the new translations of the Bible. Just to summarize that point, King James Version pais is more times translated as servant than son. Greek pais, not huios, is used in Acts 3:26, I believe, for a purpose. Pais is translated as servant in at least one another text in King James Version when referring to Jesus. Septuagint uses a word pais to translate the Hebrew word ebed, which means servant. And most importantly, the author of Acts, by using pais rather than huios, is saying that Jesus is the Messiah described by Isaiah in his 4 messianic songs, one of which we look at from Isaiah chapter 42. Here's another argument. If you read NIV, New King James Version, and a number of other relatively new Bible translations, you will not find a justification for the SDA sanctuary doctrine. And here is a quote that states this. One can discover a disturbing phenomenon by taking a quick look at the online Bible sites that give us access to many different translations. One might think that a few modern translators were simply taking too many creative liberties, but in this article I will show that they appear to have intentionally altered the Word of God with respect to the sanctuary doctrine. It might be surprising to many Adventists that mainstream translators of the past 150 years have even had a clue regarding the sanctuary doctrine's existence, and it may be even more surprising that they would go out of their way to tear it down, but the details of the case present a clear pattern. Well, let's look at what is on that particular side in terms of the accusation. Here it is. Let's compare Hebrews 9:3 and Hebrews 9:12. 9:3 should clearly be stated translated most holy place. Why the most obvious translation of 9:12 is holy place. 9:12 is the verse that has been altered according to the author of that particular website. Well, let's look at this passage, 9:12, in King James Version, and sure enough, it translates the holy place, Tahagia, from the Greek Tahagia, while New International Version or New King James Version translate Tahagia as most holy place. Well, number one, Tahagia is actually a different grammatical version of a Greek word hagion, which again in King James Version is translated in different ways as sanctuary, holy place, or holiest of all, and then also holiness. That's number one. Number two, let's look at Hebrew 9:12 in context from verse 11. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place, once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. Notice that this part of the passage, greater and more perfect tabernacle, okay, parallels this most holy place. Basically what the passage is stating here is that it refers to the sanctuary. It does not refer to any particular compartment, whether holy place or most holy place, okay, but rather the phrase most holy place refers to what? A tabernacle or sanctuary in heaven as a whole. And this translation or this interpretation is consistent with what we find in the Seventh-day Adventist commentary. Notice the context makes clear that Tahagia here refers to that greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands. That is the heavenly sanctuary. Through the translators of the King James Version rendered Tahagia holiest of all, but it does not allow that they had in mind the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. It is doubtful that they had, or rather held, any detailed views concerning the sanctuary. They apparently thought of the heavenly sanctuary or of heaven itself where Jesus went as the holiest place of all, corresponding to the most holy place in the earthly sanctuary. Okay, and so again the commentary states quite clearly that when they said most holy place, the holiest of all, they are simply referring to the heavenly sanctuary rather than any particular compartment in the sanctuary. Okay, another argument: King James Version is the most accurate translation of the Bible. Well, let's consider this. Let's look at this passage from Matthew 28:1. Okay, notice the King James Version translates this as in the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, while New International Version and New King James Version states after the Sabbath. It wasn't in the end of the Sabbath, it was after the Sabbath when Mary and the other women went to the tomb. Okay, so these two modern translations seem a little bit more accurate here. Let's look at another passage from John 13:2. King James Version states, and supper being ended, okay, while the other translations state the evening meal was in progress, the evening meal was underway during supper. Let's look at the context here. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things unto his hands, and that he was come from God. He went to God. He raised from supper and laid aside his garments and so on. Okay, notice that he raised from supper, and so supper could not have ended yet. It was during the supper when Jesus raised from the supper. Okay, the other translations, the more modern translations, are more accurate here than the King James Version. Here's another one. 1 Samuel 1:24. King James Version states, "And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bullocks," whereas the International Version states a 3-year-old bullock, and the same New Revised Standard Version said a 3-year-old bullock. Notice that in New King James Version sticks with 3 bulls here, but there is a letter 1, and in the middle column of New King James Version you have Dead Sea Scrolls, Septuagint, and the Syriac version of the Old Testament says a 3-year-old bull. So the question is, how many bulls were there? Okay, we actually have the answer in the Bible. Okay, notice here it says, "And they slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli." Okay, that's in King James Version. New King James Version, "And they slaughtered a bull and brought the child to Eli." Okay, what happened to the other ones, the other 2? Well, the answer is there were none. There was only one. King James Version is incorrectly here translating this as 3 bulls. Okay, yet another argument. If you read NIV, you will not find some biblical texts. It is true, the translators of New King James Version decided to stick with manuscripts that are in agreement, meaning there are several manuscripts that have specific passages in them, but there are only isolated, relatively older manuscripts that have some verses that they believe, the translators of New International Versions, that those isolated older manuscripts had stuff that was added that is not again found in earlier manuscripts that are in agreement, meaning that they all don't contain specific passages of the Bible. But if this is a problem for you, meaning if the fact that there are some texts missing in NIV is a problem for you, you should also discard the King James Version. Why? Because there are some passages that are missing in King James Version, and I will give you an example. This is what is found in the first book of Samuel, chapter 10, verse 27. "But the children of Belial," I guess it's pronounced, "said, How shall this man save us? And they despised him and brought no presents, but he held his peace." Well, when you look at New Revised Standard Version, this passage is much bigger. This entire passage is missing in King James Version. Okay. So what is the conclusion based on what I shared with you here? Here's my conclusion. Thou is better off using other than the King James Version translations of the Bible, and especially versions such as New King James Version, for example, are simply more accurate, and you are better off to use that particular one, and it will be easier for you to read it because you will not have to deal with thou and other passages like that. Thank you for watching.